I'm Bob Gruen, and I'd like to thank Saatchi for inviting me here today. It's a real challenge to try to sum up and express some things, ideas about my life in just 7 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. I live in New York City, and I photograph rock and roll musicians. I didn't come to this lifestyle as a journalist. I live it, and I enjoy it. Many people like to have music playing in the background when they work, but I like to have it in the foreground. For me, rock and roll is the freedom to express yourself loudly. And for me, nothing is quite as exciting as the feeling of anarchy that happens in a crowd of screaming people with just 4 or 5 guys playing on stage. I assume most of you are familiar with my picture of John Lennon with the New York City t-shirts, and you've probably seen my picture of John Lennon with the Statue of Liberty. But not everybody's aware that the same guy who took those pictures also took the picture of Led Zeppelin in front of their airplane. And I documented the New York rock scene as well as the English punk groups like the Clash and the Sex Pistols. And in fact, I photographed most major rock and roll acts in the last 45 years. From Muddy Waters to Green Day. I'll explain briefly how I got to do this. My mother was a lawyer, and her hobby was photography. And at a very early age, she took me into her darkroom, where I learned to develop and print photos. When I was 8, she gave me a Kodak Brownie Hawkeye camera, and I started to take pictures of my family and events at school. My mom also taught me that no is not an answer to accept, but it can be the beginning of an interesting conversation. An idea that helped me get my first photo pass at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, the year that Bob Dylan famously played with a rock band. And to me, it was as though he was declaring that rock and roll was the folk music of America. Now, after my school years, I shared an apartment in Greenwich Village with friends who formed a rock band. And when they got a record deal, they used my pictures for promotion. And their record company hired me to photograph other groups. In 1970, I met Ike and Tina Turner, who liked my photos a lot, and they took me along with them on their tours. My first album cover was for Tina Turner. And this led to meeting many more people in the music business. And after I was included in the first book of rock photography, I met John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and that opened many more doors for me. It was actually the managers of their backup band, the Elephant's Memory, that asked me to photograph Aerosmith and the New York Dolls. And it was through the New York Dolls that I met Malcolm McLaren, who came to New York to show the band some stage outfits that he designed and made for them. And when I went to England a year later, in 1976, Malcolm was the only contact I had there. And by that time, he was managing the Sex Pistols, and he took me to a club where I met Johnny Rotten and the other Sex Pistols, and the Clash, and many other people in the emerging English punk scene. In the early 70s, I was a photographer for Rock Scene magazine, which covered the whole lifestyle of rock and roll, with full-page layouts of pictures on stage, backstage, and behind the scenes. We not only worked with major popular bands, but also with new bands that we just liked, the Ramones, Blondie, Patti Smith, who were just starting out and playing clubs like CBGB's and Max's Kansas City. Because the magazine covered the whole rock scene, it gave me a good reason to photograph every aspect of the rock life. This is something I enjoyed and I spent a lot of time doing, even though I was paid very little or sometimes nothing for the work. I often felt driven to photograph the scene, sensing somehow the future importance of this time in history. And it seems that I was right, as many people come up to me today and say they wish they lived in the 70s because so much seemed to be happening then. I had my first big exhibition of my work in the early 80s, and now I make more money selling signed photo prints than I ever got taking them in the first place. I've stayed busy since then, mainly photographing musicians, and today my current favorite is Green Day, who grant me extraordinary access because they're as much a fan of my work as I am of their music. And I've just released this new book called Rock Scene, the title spelled in the visual sense, and it's a photo collection of my entire career. And going through the book, looking through what I've done has made me think a lot about my life and think about how I've done it. And a friend of mine, the Grammy Award-winning director Don Letts, recently made a film about me, and there are interviews with about a dozen people who know me well, Iggy Pop, Alice Cooper, Yoko Ono, and Debbie Harry, and Billie Joe Armstrong. And they all talked about my laid-back personality and how my personality had a lot to do with my success in my career. And that really made me think about it, because though people compliment me a lot on the quality of my work, they also tell me that I'm a nice guy and that I'm easy to get along with and that they enjoy having me around, which is a good thing to hear, and it seems to be one of the reasons that I was allowed such access. So I think back to something that Joe Franklin would close his TV show with every night, and that was that it's nice to be important, but it's more important to be nice. And that's always struck me and actually seemed to help me in my life and in my career. And there's a story I read about a woman who lived to be 122 years old. And she was some amazing character. She rode her bicycle until she was 108, and she only gave up smoking at 117. She lived in Arles in France, and during one of the many interviews about her old age, she was asked whether she had known Vincent van Gogh when he lived there. And she said yes, she had met him, and that her boyfriend had known him, but she had nothing good to say about the now world-renowned artist. She said he was a nasty and rude man who used to sell pencils around the village green, and she never liked him. And it was that little story that made me think again how important it is to be nice, because you never know who you're talking with, and you could just be talking to some guy you know, and you don't know that 100 years later, his 19-year-old girlfriend is going to be talking trash about you in the press. Now, mine wasn't an easy life. My conservative family kept asking me when I was going to stop hanging out with rock bands and get a real job. But I couldn't be them. I had to be me and keep doing what I was doing. And I often felt that I had a feeling of being a failure, but to see my work so widely appreciated today is very satisfying. Having both this new book and a documentary has made me thankful that as a creative person, I've been able to have a fulfilling life and see my work represented in installations and galleries and marketed worldwide, and to be able to see the rewards of it in my lifetime. I'd like to leave you with a thought from John Lennon, that there are no problems, only solutions. This is also something that my grandmother expressed when she told me that I shouldn't worry about things I couldn't change, and only about the things that I could do something about. And it's taken me many years to understand what she meant, but today I try not to worry too much, and I spend my time being positive about my life. So thank you for having me here today.